Hello and welcome to the Pro Wrestling Exuberant. I'm Russell Franklin and I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to have you listening. This program is going to showcase a wide range of topics from both the current scene of pro wrestling and the past. We're going to talk about the wrestling shows on TV, different promotions, big and small, and a lot in between. The wrestlers themselves, some of my favorite kinds of wrestling merchandise. We're talking books, figures, DVDs, programs, pretty much anything pro wrestling related that grabs my attention, we're going to showcase it here. A little bit about myself. I first started watching wrestling close to 40 years ago in 1985. I had the great honor of working in the wrestling business itself in the 90s. I first started as a magazine writer back when wrestling magazines were very prominent on newsstands. I transitioned that into working as a pro wrestling referee, which was one of the most fun things I've ever done in my life. And I'm going to weave in stories from some of those experiences as well, talking about some of the different wrestlers I crossed paths with that I had grown up watching on TV, some of the rising stars I met that went on to become big stars in wrestling, and some of the interviews that I did with some of the legends of the business. So let's get off and running. Right now, I feel it's never been a greater time to be a pro wrestling fan in the time since I first discovered the great thing we know as professional wrestling in the year 1985. There's so many diverse viewing options right now. You have WWE and AEW, the top 2 rated TV shows on there. You have NWA, TNA, MLW, GCW, Ring of Honor. Tons and tons of great independent promotions out there. Maybe with wrestlers you've never heard of, but they're really talented and the shows are a lot of fun to watch. You have access to Japanese promotions like NJPW, Noah, Stardom. There's European promotions like Rev Pro, and there's Mexican promotions like CMLL, AAA. You can get access to Australian independent shows. There's so much out there to watch, and there's so much good stuff to watch. This really is the golden age of wrestling in many, many ways, in my opinion. And I feel it hasn't always been so easy to access wrestling, and so much of it. Streaming and apps have really made it so much wrestling is available to us, and from so many different parts of the world, where you can track down stuff, you can follow the leagues, you can find what you like, discover different wrestlers. Now, it hasn't always been so easy to access pro wrestling and so much of it, in my opinion. Streaming and apps have made so much of it available from all parts of the world to us. When I first started watching wrestling in the mid-'80s, it wasn't so easy to always track down wrestling and follow it and keep up with it. It was a lot of effort sometimes involved with it. Now, I mentioned I first started watching wrestling in 1985 in the fall. And let's go back a little bit to 1985 and give kind of the context of the time period, because I think it's an important time period in wrestling. A few months before I first started watching wrestling, WrestleMania 1 had just occurred. WWF was becoming a pop culture phenomena. Hulk Hogan. I had heard of WWF. I had heard of Hulk Hogan. I didn't know much about it. I knew people that watched it. Hulk Hogan had just been on the cover of Sports Illustrated. I think that introduced him to a lot of new fans, created a new audience, people that would become lifelong fans like myself. But where did it come in where I actually were like, okay, I want to follow wrestling. I want to try this, watch it, check it out. It was kind of in a roundabout way. I used to watch Saturday morning cartoons, and one of the shows on there was a show called Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, and I'm going to feature this in a later episode and do some kind of showcases of the content. And I wonder if there's anybody else out there that this was their first exposure to wrestling. From what I understand, this wasn't the voices of the actual wrestlers, and the storylines, as I recall, were not really involving wrestling, but it had the characters. It had, my memories going back here, Hulk Hogan. I remember Junkyard Dog on there, Jimmy Snuka, Andre the Giant, Roddy Piper, all the really prominent names of that era. And I watched this show for probably a couple weeks, and I was like, and I liked it. And I liked it enough that I thought, oh, this is pretty good. I wonder what real pro wrestling is like. I wonder what these guys are like when they're actually doing the pro wrestling, these different characters. Wrestling aired on Saturday mornings, and it so happened that I was flipping the channels shortly after I was thinking I wanted to check out pro wrestling, and I came across the show that was syndicated at the time called WWF Superstars. Now, going back a little bit to the context of 85, what else was going on around 1985? I was talking about the WWF and the pop culture phenomena. Now, wrestling was undergoing a major change because the territory system was in place. And the territory system, by that I mean that wrestling was kind of divided into territories in different regions, and there was a lot of these promotions that weren't national. The big three at the time, as they would be identified when I would read magazines, were WWF, NWA, which was Jim Crockett Promotions, and AWA, which was run by Vern Gagne. There were other promotions with really big followings. There was World Class, which had some really good exposure with the Von Erichs. Memphis, identified with Jerry Lawler, was a very well-known promotion. And there were quite a few others. Within a few years, the territory system would be gone. And we'll go into that in some other shows. Wrestling was about to undergo some major changes. Okay, jumping back to my experiences watching it. So I'm flipping the channels, and I come on WWF Superstars. The very first image I saw on the screen was Don Morocco and Mr. Fuji, and they were hanging Ricky the Dragon Steamboat on the ring by his belt. And I was immediately drawn into this. So much that I can remember that clearly in my head now, thinking back and watching this. Another clip I want to look up. I should look up and watch again. But yeah, this drew me in. And there were all these larger-than-life characters. Like I said, 80s, you grew up, if you were in that era, you were watching a lot of action movies, I think, if you were into that stuff. And that was a hot genre. And I was drawn in by all these characters. They were the same guys that were on the cartoon and more. So I watched this show for a couple months, and I really got into this quick. And I wanted to go see a live wrestling match. And the very first live wrestling match I saw was in December 1985 on Christmas Day. And it was headlined by Hulk Hogan versus Randy Macho Man Savage. And anybody that ever went to see a Hulk Hogan match in the mid-80s, I think you'll remember it because, man, the crowds were so into this. They were so loud. It was thunderous. And for someone's first exposure to wrestling, it was cool. It was cool. There's two things I can remember from this show distinctively. The very first thing I can remember is the opening match of the show. And by the way, I do remember also the place was completely sold out. It was hard to get tickets back then. So the very first match was S.D. Jones versus Mike Sharp. On the tours around the country back then for WWF, you had these guys that would work these kind of opening matches, and then they would be on TV, and you would usually see them. They usually wouldn't win when they were on TV, but they had kind of little followings. And Iron Mike Sharp and S.D. Jones were probably two of the more prominent ones. So that was the first match. The other match I remember is Hulk Hogan versus Randy Macho Man Savage. And I have pictures from this. I recently was unpacking some boxes and I came across a ton of pictures from this card, and it was really cool to see Hulk Hogan in these pictures. But I remember my distinct memory of this is after Hulk Hogan won the match, at the time there were these LJN rubber Hulk Hogan figures that were very popular, of which I still have one. And people were throwing them in the ring. And one of the pictures I have, you could see the figure flying into the ring and Hogan kind of looking over there. And I remember as a kid watching this thinking, man, I can't believe these people are throwing their figures in there. Don't they want to keep the figures? But people loved Hulk Hogan that much. I mean, they just were so wild about him. And it was cool. It was a fun experience. And I kept watching wrestling, just WWF, for a little bit longer. And then I kind of, was seeing these magazines on newsstands, and I started seeing there's other leagues out there. There's other parts of the wrestling world. So I start going looking for other leagues on TV and what I can find. So what I came across was the NWA. And this would have been early 1986 when I discovered them. And NWA was hot. It was at the time. It was growing fast and getting popular. And the NWA was Jim Crockett Promotions. And you were talking the Four Horsemen, the original Four Horsemen: Ric Flair, Tully Blanchard, Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, Dusty Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, Magnum TA, the Rock and Roll Express, Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express. Still a lot of people that are my absolute favorites. And I got into watching this show, and they had the TBS, or maybe in WTBS at the time, the channel, but the 6:05 on Saturday night in the studio show. They had their syndicated shows on Saturday and Sunday, and it was fun. This was a little bit different than watching WWF, whereas the WWF was characters, and I don't want to say cartoonish feel, but it was more of these characters and gimmicks. These guys didn't really have their gimmicks. This was like they were in there fighting, and they had feuds and these storylines and conflict, and it was good. It was good. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I started going to their live shows too, and they were packed crowds and a different audience maybe than the WWF shows, but it was fun. Back then at the place I used to go to, a lot of the wrestlers stayed at a hotel right across the street, so they would walk to the arena. You know, you could get autographs from people. I remember one time, you know, Flair would pull up in the limo with the Four Horsemen, and you know, it was much different than it was now, but it was very, very fun. So this is the schedule of wrestling that I recall back then, okay? And as we were into 1986, and I'm quickly becoming a rabid wrestling fan, watching a ton of this all the time. It's just buying as many of the magazines as I can, trying to learn about all the different wrestlers. You had the Saturday morning lineup, which would have been WWF Superstars and the syndicated NWA show. And these shows would have intercuts. By that I mean they'd have the matches and then they'd cut to almost like a commercial, but what it would be is a different wrestlers promoting their upcoming match at the local arena. And that's how, you know, you'd see who was wrestling at the show next month. And there'd be one arena always had the WWF matches that was maybe 40 minutes from where I lived, and one that was 30 minutes in a different direction from where I lived always had NWA every month. So there was like 2 big live shows every month you could go to. Saturday night you had the 605 TBS, or I guess maybe it was WTBS at the time. That was a studio show. Sunday you had I believe it was called All American Wrestling. You also had Wrestling Challenge, I think that was Saturday afternoons, which is WWF. Monday you had Prime Time Wrestling on USA Network with hosted by Bobby Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon, and they would do a lot of cuts of showing. They'd be in a studio, but there'd be different matches they'd introduce that would be from the different arenas across the country. Pay-per-views didn't really exist at the time. As in '86 there was WrestleMania 2, but it wasn't on the local cable pay-per-view like kind of access where I was. I think you could go to like movie theaters and watch it. So pretty much you'd have to get videos from people that maybe somehow had copies of tapes of these. You'd rent them from video stores months after the event. But yeah, that's how it was at the time. WrestleMania 3 was the first big event I remember being on pay-per-view. I remember, and I wish I had kept it, these flyers that the cable company sent, probably like about maybe the size of half of a piece of like kind of school notebook paper you'd see. And it was a picture of Andre and a picture of Hogan, and it was hyping the big WrestleMania pay-per-view match. And that was the first one on our local cable that you could buy, and you'd have to call a phone number and order it. And I remember that one well. Because it was in the Pontiac Silverdome, and it was just a massive crowd. I mean, the perspective of it when the show first started, and they had all the lights on, you know, in the opening match, it was just massive. It was huge, and you were like, wow, this is really, really popular. You had Steamboat versus Savage. You had Hogan versus Andre. I mean, it was a memorable card. Another big thing around the same time that I remember watching a lot and enjoying was the NWA Clash of Champions series. Now this was free. It was on TV, cable. It wasn't a pay-per-view. The very first one was '88. It was Sting and Flair. Now this, I think, was really pivotal in a lot of ways, because I think this was like the card that really kind of put Sting on the map. You know, he had been around before, and he had been in UWF, and he was building a following, and he had kind of come into NWA when they absorbed UWF. But this match kind of, I think in my mind, really, and a lot of people, it really elevated him. It was a 5-match card. It occurred on March 27th, 1988, and I had to look some of these details up, believe me. It was Greensboro Coliseum in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it said there were 6,000 people in attendance. And now it did air head-to-head with WrestleMania 4, and I do remember that. They ran that as a free event against WrestleMania. Another league that I discovered at this time and enjoyed watching a lot was AWA, and they were on ESPN. believe like 5 days a week. This is Larry Zbyszko, Kurt Hennig before he was Mr. Perfect, Scott Hall long before he was Razor Ramon, Nick Bockwinkel, Buddy Rose and Doug Summers, Shawn Michaels, Stan Hansen, Sergeant Slaughter, Greg Gagne. And they were based out of Minnesota, and that was another league I enjoyed. They had World Class, who you could access, which had the Von Erichs. I think initially part of the NWA and then kind of withdrew in 86 to become their own promotion. And then Rick Rude was the first champion. Another league that I really liked a lot was the UWF that I have fond memories of. Now, they were initially Mid-South, and then they went to trying to make a national expansion. And they changed the name to UWF. It was a Saturday afternoon show that was in syndication. And the big thing that was different about these was they had what I would say competitive matches. By that I mean NWA and WWF on TV was primarily a big star against a guy maybe you had not heard of, and they weren't what you would call competitive matches. Or, they'd be against some of these regular guys that you would see there every week that would lose matches. But where I'd first seen Sting, first seen Rick Steiner, Eddie Gilbert was another name there. He was their manager. Dr. Death Steve Williams was there. The Fabulous Freebirds. Now, I was surprised to read when I was looking up a little bit about UWF to refresh my memory. I was surprised to read they were only really around a little over a year before Crockett bought them out, Jim Crockett, and they were absorbed into kind of NWA. And I remember them getting absorbed into there, but I seem to think they were on TV for longer than that. I mean, I recall most of the UWF guys kind of being phased out, kind of disappearing. I think Sting was the one that really kind of rose up the ranks in NWA of that crew. Another thing about that era too that was cool, like I said, magazines were very, very plentiful on the newsstands, and I have a huge collection of them from that era. It seemed like there were dozens of magazines around. Right now, you have pretty much just Pro Wrestling Illustrated that's around it. But back then there was a lot of different magazines. I mean, even Pro Wrestling Illustrated seemed like they had a ton of sister publications like The Wrestler, Inside Wrestling. I mean, some of these magazines were quarterly, some were monthly, but there was a ton there. Like, you could go in a newsstand and find it seemed like 10, 12 different magazines at a time. And back then, the way they covered wrestling, they all covered it like it was real. By that I mean there wasn't like behind the scenes gossip or content. It was covering it as an extension of what you were seeing on television. In other episodes, I'm going to pull out some of these magazines. I'll go through some of the content and give you kind of a feel of how wrestling was covered then, which it's pretty cool to see. So by the early 90s, I was like, as I'm growing and learning more about wrestling and the different things going on, things were changing in that era. UWF, like I said, had gotten into NWA. Crockett kind of became WCW, and Turner bought them out. AWA was done. It was kind of ending with no audience for them in this thing called the Team Challenge Series. World Class was done. WWF was strong. Magazines were going away. It seemed like almost overnight all the magazines were gone. I mean, and when you look back at wrestling historically, I think a lot of people look at the early 90s as kind of a down period, and the major turnaround would come in the later 90s, with the Monday Night Wars, but that'll be for another episode. Right now, in the present day, to me, it feels like wrestling is at an all-time popular. I mean, I think certainly the stigma of being a fan is greatly, greatly reduced. And by that, I mean, and some of you may recall these, I mean, it seemed like in the past, 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s, if you really liked wrestling and somebody heard about it, they almost kind of make fun of you, and you'd be arguing back with them. And I think that stigma is reduced. I think it's much more mainstream. It's rightfully so looked at as cool, which it's always been cool in my opinion. It gets more respect in the mainstream or from the casual person, and not as looked down upon, because wrestling is great entertainment, the greatest in my opinion you can watch. I mean, right now I like watching a lot of different product. Pretty much if it's well filmed, I'm gonna check it out. I mean, right now, I watching WWE, AEW. I mean, just between those two promotions, if you were to watch everything that's a lot. But there's a lot of other great promotions out there that I watch and I want to showcase. And if you're not watching them, encourage you to check them out and see if you really like them and want to, add that to your wrestling schedule. There's promotions like TNA, NWA, GCW, MLW, Ring of Honor, New Japan, Noah. There's several independents that are really, really good that I really want to showcase and show what's going on there and help you track them down and seek them out. So what are some of the things that I'm enjoying watching right now? WWE. If you told me 6 months ago I'd say this, I'd say absolutely not. If you said I would, a year ago would have said this, I would have been no way. Because see, I largely checked out from watching WWE. I'd say probably about a decade ago. Believe it or not, right? So I hadn't seen a full episode of Raw, hadn't seen a full episode of SmackDown. Maybe would occasionally put it on, watch the first few minutes, but I just wasn't into the product. I'd watch the monthly events, but I'd always run like eight months behind, believe it or not, in watching these. It would take me months to get through them. So what brought me back to the product after I checked out of it a long time ago, and I still kept watching wrestling. I mean, I've always watched TNA. I've always kept up with that. When there was Lucha Underground, I watched that. When the Ring of Honor was on at different times, I would watch that. I was always kind of watching some of the alternative products that were out there. When AEW first came around, I was watching that right from the start. But what is it that not only brought me back to Raw and SmackDown, and I watch NXT as well now, but what brought me back to give it a chance, and not only to and now to say, well, this is what I'm really into watching, and I'm surprised to say that. For me, what initially started to get me back into the product was when Cody Rhodes went back there. I've always been a big fan of Cody Rhodes. I've followed his career and watched him almost since the very beginning. I remember when he first came into WWE, he had those initial couple matches with Hardcore Holly. I remember them well. I've always liked the way he's carried himself in the ring. I've always enjoyed his actual in-ring work. When he speaks on the mic, and I've followed him and been a fan of his through the different sort of personas he's had. Dashing Cody Rhodes, Stardust when he was in the faction with Ted DiBiase Jr. and Randy Orton. So I've followed him all throughout different parts of his career, and I've always thought of him and seen him as a top guy, a guy that should be in the main events. And he never was quite presented the way I kind of wanted to see him present. I wonder if you guys out there have some of your favorites that you feel kind of the same way about, like that, with what I'm saying, that you feel like they should be at a much higher level than they're presented. And it was very gratifying to watch him as he kind of would rise up through these ranks and get presented in a higher and higher level. You know, he left WWE that first time, right? And he went out and worked for all these different promotions. And I think it kind of was like he was revitalized in a lot of ways, maybe the way the viewing audience was seeing him. And then AEW started and he comes in there. And I really enjoyed seeing him in AEW. I mean, he had some really great matches in there, but then something strange kind of happened, right? The crowd turned on him. And I don't mean it's like he wasn't doing anything heelish. He wasn't changing his persona. He was still himself, but people started booing him. And it kind of reminded me of John Cena from, the mid-2000s, where people were booing him and he was supposed to be the good guy. But this was different, because with Cena, he kind of grinned and winked at it, and they kind of had fun with it, I think, to a large degree. Does anybody remember when John Cena went to the ECW arena and he used to, he'd throw his shirt out into the crowd, and they kept throwing it back to him when they were doing. All right, so it kind of reminded me of that, but there was something different about this. It just didn't feel right, and I didn't quite understand what it was that made the crowd turn on him. And you kind of sense watching him, I think it kind of bothered him. And I know you'd hear stuff. Well, he should go heel. He should do this, but that wasn't his character. And I think as a longtime fan of his, or any really big fan of his, you want to see him be true to who he is, right? So when I first heard he was going to WWE, I was really surprised. At first, I was really surprised. I was like, wow, he was one of these guys that you think of like as the founders of AEW. I can't believe, of all the people, Cody Rhodes is the one that's leaving, the big name that's going to leave and go to WWE. And at first it kind of bothered me, right? Because I didn't watch WWE. I wasn't a fan of the product. I had this notion of what they were presenting, and I didn't like it, even though I really wasn't watching it. But I got curious, right? Because I reading about him debuting there and what's going on, and I'm curious. I kind of just want to see him there and just see the reaction. I'm curious, right? So I tune in initially to see that, but on the premium live events, not on the actual TV shows. It was pretty cool to see kind of the reaction. He was getting this huge reaction and the loud cheers. It's kind of how I felt about him as a fan. And it was pretty gratifying to see that kind of reaction to him. And I'm kind of watching him, and you know what? The smile was genuine, and he looked happy. He looked happy to be there. And I'm interested. I'm interested in seeing where this is going to go with him. So that's what initially got me kind of watching it, at least the premium live events, more current, and getting a little more of a feel and an interest in the product. But what got me to turn on and actually watch Monday Night Raw and give it a chance was CM Punk. Now, I've always been a huge CM Punk fan. One of my favorite memories as a viewer watching is the pipe bomb speech he did well over a decade ago. There's always something I've liked when wrestling kind of blurs the lines of reality when these guys talk, and I think that is one of the more famous moments I can think of, just one of the more electric moments as a viewer. Go back and watch it if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about. But for me, it was a really cool moment. I've always enjoyed his matches, again, his in-ring matches. I've always enjoyed hearing him talk on the mic. And I've always kind of got the sense, CM Punk, the person, he is who he is, and he doesn't make any bones about it, as you could say. He just kind of comes out there and presents himself. I've always got the sense with CM Punk that there's some semblance of realism, and by that I mean just him speaking is not just a character coming up with some lines. It's kind of him just speaking from the heart, whatever that is that he's trying to convey, and you could pick up on that passion as a viewer. And I was really, really excited when he showed up in AEW. Really, really excited. I really never thought he would come back to wrestling. I wanted to see him come back. Of course, as a big fan of somebody you do want to see, and they leave, and you feel like they have more time they could have been in the ring, you do want to see them make that comeback. So I was really excited when he came back. And I liked a lot of his matches that he was having there. I thought what he was doing in AEW when he came in there was a lot of guys that he would wrestle them, and to me, he was elevating them, and they were guys with huge amounts of potential. Powerhouse Hobbs, Darby Allin, and he was elevating them to where it's like they were like, to me, watching them now, the way I wanted to see guys like that presented, these young guys that I thought were really talented. They looked like main event level stars. It was just something about the way he worked with these younger guys that I just thought they looked like the proverbial $1,000,000 in the ring, and really could show an audience what they were capable of. Because I feel like in wrestling, it takes two, right? It takes a good foil. It takes a good opponent sometimes to really showcase the best of someone else that hasn't had that chance to show it yet. So I was really enjoying that. And I'm not going to go into all the behind the scenes drama of what, of CM Punk leaving and what went on. That's been covered tons of places, and everyone's probably got a different opinion on this. But the thing is, to me, none of that I don't really matter to me, all that stuff. What do I mean by that, okay? I'm a fan of CM Punk, so I just want to see him wrestle. Whatever went on, right? He left for a while. He came back. He's gone, right? And so I was disappointed with how that whole run went with AEW. I was expecting a lot more out of that. How could you not? It seemed like it was just building steam, and then it ended. So he goes to WWE. I really didn't think that was going to happen, and intrigued when it did. Very intrigued when it did. And that's what got me to turn on Monday Night Raw. I was reading about him in there, and then I just wanted to see him there. when I watched Monday Night Raw, I liked how he was being presented. It was great seeing him seeing him there, seeing him again. I was real excited for this new chapter in his career. But you know what else I realized? This is a really good wrestling show. There's a lot of stuff going on here that's really good. I liked how there were storylines that were very clear, and they were building to stuff. The characters were very well developed. I liked how these guys had mic time. Just the whole show just flowed so well. It reminded me that what I really like about wrestling and what drew me into it was characters and storylines. I think maybe I forgot about that a little bit because it seems like the trend has kind of been where it's like, oh, they're talking more about the in-ring match, but there's something about a good storyline that's very satisfying. You know, one of the best storylines that I've seen in so long was this whole Cody Rhodes, Rock, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins dynamic. It's just so entertaining, the whole interaction between all of them. And it's been a long time since I've been eager on anything to really see a specific segment and how it's going to play out on the next episode. But you know, it's for me as a viewer, I like the whole balance of what they're presenting. We have these talking segments. We have good matches. You know, there's all these storylines and they're easy to follow going on. And I used to be, I think, one of those people that were like, why do they need writers in wrestling, right? Like WWE has a creative team behind the scenes that kind of, you know, structure some of this almost like a script. And I never quite understood that. But after watching how well this show flows, Raw, I think I finally got it. Then I started watching SmackDown. I had the exact same impression. This is a really good wrestling show. I really enjoy this. Then checked out NXT. Same thing. So I'm just loving WWE right now. All the product is really great. I'm enjoying it, and I'm still kind of amazed that I kind of was tuned out of it for so long. What else am I liking right now, right? Let's talk about specific wrestlers. It was really great to see Will Ospreay show up in AEW and be on a national TV show here in the US. I heard his name for a long time before I actually started seeing his matches. The first match of his that I saw where I realized, wow, this guy is absolutely amazing, and he quickly became one of my favorite wrestlers, was a match in a promotion in England called Rev Pro. This would have been a couple years ago against a wrestler named Michael Oku, who I think there's another name. I just got to believe this guy's gonna be in one of the promotions here in the U.S. Amazingly talented cruiserweight. So I was reading about this match, and they kept talking about how they were telling a story in the ring. And another concept maybe I've heard before a lot, and I don't think until I saw the Michael Oku Will Ospreay match I got it, what that means exactly and how important that can be and how entertaining it can be as a viewer. So Will Ospreay was the British heavyweight champion, Michael Oku the cruiserweight champion. And these two worked this match where it was just Michael Oku was taking a ton of punishment and he would keep coming back, and the back and forth between the two, and and these amazing moves that Will Ospreay does, and just the whole energy in the ring. I really woke me up to what was the rave about him, and why when you read so much stuff about him, people would say he was one of the best, if not best, wrestlers in the world. I started checking out his New Japan stuff, and the more I saw this guy, the more I've really thought he was an absolutely amazing person to watch in the ring. I also enjoyed hearing him talk on the mic. Then he had his matches with Kenny Omega, right? Those are two of the best matches as a fan I've ever seen, period. I like realistic, intense, hard-hitting matches. And that's something, too, that is, over time I realized. I like there to be a sense of realism the way they're hitting each other. And to me, when I think of something like that, of hard-hitting moves, intensity, near counts, just where the guys look like they're going through an absolute fight for real in the ring, I think of those two matches. Those two really stand out. What else have I been enjoying lately? I've also been enjoying the TNA product. I've been watching them pretty consistently since probably a couple years after they started in the early 2000s. I've always thought it's been a highly underrated product. I always thought it's been a consistently good and entertaining product. I've also been enjoying watching the NWA show. They're on CW app now. I've been watching them for a couple years. I think they're underrated as well, and they're falling under the radar of a lot of um, wrestling fans. It's got a kind of an old school feel to it. Kind of reminds me a lot of watching the old TBS shows on Saturday night for NWA. But I'm enjoying that as well. The other thing I've been enjoying a lot is well filmed independence. I've kind of been rediscovering independent wrestling. I've watched it in the past live mainly, but now with apps and streaming, there's access to a lot more of it, and there's a lot of good ones all over the country. One of them, Wrestling Open, I'm going to be showcasing a little later in this episode. But there is a lot of talent on the indie scene right now, and a lot of them that have potential, in my opinion, to become significant stars in either WWE or AEW. They're on that level of talent. I'm amazed when I watch these indie shows how you can just see so many guys that and I think there's a perception sometimes maybe that indie wrestling, if you don't understand it or never watched it, it's a lower level. It's absolutely not a lower level, because there's a lot of guys on there that are just as good or better than some of the people you're seeing on TV. And there's a lot of stuff out there that's worth checking out. So let's talk more about TNA. I want to showcase them a little deeper. The promotion started in 2002. Okay, so they've been around a while. Isn't that amazing? They've been around now 22 years. It's very impressive. Very impressive. The way they initially started, it was right after WCW had collapsed. Not too long after. They started, their business model was like a weekly pay-per-view, like a reduced price concept. It lasted a little over 2 years. I recall watching one or two of these. It was $9.99 per event. So it was kind of like a TV show, but you had to pay every week to kind of follow it. I think that was expensive for that era and a huge commitment back then in the early 2000s, basically for someone to commit to paying around $40 a month to follow a product. When they kind of did away with that concept, they were picked up. They were on Fox Sports, and they were on Spike, and I pretty much fairly consistently watched it, like I was mentioning earlier, and followed them as they moved from onto different networks. Even when I wasn't watching much wrestling for a time, there was a time I got really into boxing and was actually watching a ton of that, and that kind of brought me into watching MMA, and my wrestling viewing probably for a little bit was way scaled back. But the one thing I always watched and kept up with and DVR'd was TNA. So I've always kind of feel like I've consistently watched that and never kind of left that show for any period of time. They rebranded to Impact. They came back to TNA in early 2024, but you call it Impact, call it TNA. I like, I'm calling them TNA again, and I kind of like saying that. They just rebranded back to that this year in January. They were Impact for a number of years. So looking forward to what kind of changes that'll bring. I remember back in the day, TNA in the mid-2000s used to do a lot of cool merchandising. They had figure lines back then. I have almost every one of the figures from the early lines. Not the best quality figures, and sometimes the faces were kind of as far as like resemblance. But it was cool to have an alternative product to get. I remember I had the TNA wrestling ring as merchandise. They were always doing deals on TV, selling bundles of different products. The two coolest TNA merchandise I have that I actually have framed on my wall right now. It's a picture of AJ Styles and Rhino from Elevation X pay-per-view. I'm just going to read it to you real quick what it says on there. It says, on March 11, 2007, Destination X, the War Machine Rhino defeated the phenomenal AJ Styles in the most dangerous match in TNA history, Elevation X, limited edition, 62 of 150, and it says Total Nonstop Action Wrestling TNA. It's got the logo. It's got a picture of the two of them. It looks kind of like a scaffold. It's kind of hard to describe with this X, but think of like an X in kind of metal above the ring, and AJ Styles is midair falling off of it. Rhino's standing on top of it. It's got autographs from both of them. They're legible autographs. That's a big thing for me with autographs, that I want them to be legible. If it's just a scribble, it doesn't mean much to me. The other one I have is from that same year, 2007, King of the Mountain, Kurt Angle on there when he won the TNA title the first time. That one autographed. He's standing like on the second rope and he's holding the belt up in the air. It's very cool. That one's from June 17th, 2007. King of the Mountain match he won at Slammiversary. Limited edition, 63 of 200. So they did some cool stuff. And then hopefully they'll get back to that. I feel like their merchandise kind of isn't as prevalent as it's been. But let's talk a little bit about their weekly show, Impact. I want to kind of give you an overview of a recent episode and a feel for it. And I hope if you're not watching it, you'll give them a chance and check it out and see what you think for yourself. Much like I did with Raw, kind of go back and give it a chance, even if you stopped watching them a long time ago, TNA. I feel like a good episode to give you a feel for what their product is like and what I like about it is one that kind of leads in to one of their big events. They have, I'd say I think it's roughly 9 times a year through their streaming app. They have these like kind of pay-per-view events. You can get them separately outside the streaming app, I think, for like reduced price. The last time I saw them, I feel like they were $9.99. But for their streaming app, you can get all their shows. You get Impact, get all the old archival footage on TNA Plus, and you can get these events. So let me talk about their actual weekly show, Impact, and kind of give you an overview of a recent episode, so you can get a feel for that, and hopefully you'll give this product a chance if you're not watching it and check it out and see what you think of it. So the episode I want to give you a feel for was the go home show to their Sacrifice event in March. And the thing with this product, good overall, and this show kind of highlights this. Good overall matches. The storylines are there. The character development's there. It's just a well done show. So in this episode, they're talking about the recent signing of Nick Nemeth, the former Dolph Ziggler. Another guy I've always enjoyed watching, and I'm very excited to see him in this next chapter of his career. And it seems like they're going to be heavily building the promotion around him. We'll see where this goes, but it seems like he's going to be in a top level position as you would expect him to be coming in there. I've always thought of him as someone that was like, should be world champion and a long run at it at that. I've always seen him kind of as the complete package, from the look and the physique to the movement and talking. And there was something about him that always reminded me of Shawn Michaels. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it always kind of reminded me of Shawn Michaels. And I feel like he's going to be someone that's going to evolve really into the face of this brand. So it'll be fun to watch. I think they're going to do a slow build to putting the title on him, but we'll see where that goes. And then Mustafa Ali, who was also recently in WWE, is the X Division champ, and he comes across here the way they're presenting him as a huge star. I mean, he really is showcased well. He's doing kind of this gimmick. It's kind of like a political character, like I don't know if you could say as a candidate, someone running for office or maybe somebody in office, but kind of arrogant guy, security detail with him. But I like the character. I'm not that familiar with his work because I wasn't watching him much because he was in WWE when I wasn't watching it, but I've always read a lot of stuff where he's gotten a lot of hype for being very talented. And he is the X Division champ. X Division's like their cruiserweight division. It's always been a big part of their history. And I think that he's going to be a big part of TNA in this new era of TNA of, Nick Nemeth and Mustafa Ali, two faces of the brand. So the show opens with Mustafa Ali. And like I said, he's doing this political candidate type character. He's got the Secret Service types with him on the entrance. And he recently won the X Division title at their No Surrender event over Chris Sabin. And this match with Kevin Kite, who I know from New Japan Strong. I'm not that familiar with his work, but everything I've read about him has always been very good. Mustafa Ali has these kind of underlinks with him, the kind of henchmen, the Good Hands tag team, John Schuyler and Jason Hotch. There's a lot going on in this match. The Good Hands, interfering. It leads to Kushida and Chris Sabin coming out. Ends up with Kevin being taken out. Alex Shelley comes out with a crutch. And later there's a backstage segment that hints at tension between Alex Shelley and Chris Sabin, the Motor City Machine Guns. But it may sound a little confusing the way I'm describing it, but when you actually watch it play out, it works well. It's easy to follow. Ali's shown as a star in this whole engagement, as he should be as the X Division champ, and there's a secondary story of tension with the Motor City Machine Guns. Next, we get Ash by Elegance, who is in WWE as Dana Brooke. This is a new character they're introducing. She's got her own ring announcer. I like the repackaging they're doing here with a different name and character. Next up, we get Steve Macklin in a backstage segment. This is done real creatively. He's kind of just talking to the camera, almost like you just put it in front of him, on a chair, and he gets knocked out from behind, and then someone picks up the camera, and it's Nick Nemeth. This flows into Kushida and Alex Shelley versus the Good Hands. Kushida and Shelley win and establishes more tension going on there, with Alex Shelley kind of hinting like there's going to be a heel turn from him. And that's kind of the wrestling formula I've always liked, where they give you hints and they're dropping little clues along the way. Next, we get Masha Slamovich versus Dani Luna. This is highlighting an upcoming tag team match they're going to have with Masha and Killer Kelly versus Dani Luna and Jody Threat for the titles. Dani Luna wins here. It's a good setup for a title match. Next, we get PCO versus Alan Angels. We get a video package that kind of explains the reason of the match. It's kind of the result of PCO shoving Alan Angels during a talk show type segment he has called Soundcheck. It's a one-sided PCO win. Angels then gets wiped out by Khan after the match. And Khan is a pay-per-view match with PCO coming up. So these two kind of have their kind of in-ring confrontation. We get a Crazy Steve character package. Next, we get Eric Young comes out to talk about his title match coming with Moose, who is the current world champion there, Moose. Eric Young gets beaten down by the System, which is a newer faction there. It's Eddie Edwards, Alicia Edwards, Brian Myers, Moose, Ace Austin, and Chris Bay, who are tag team, come out. They're called ABC. They come out and make the save. Next up, we get Dirty Dango and Josh Alexander in an excellent match. Josh Alexander, immensely talented guy. First saw him in a tag team with Ethan Page, the North, here in TNA. And then when Ethan Page left, they really pushed Alexander as a single, and he's something special. He had a run with the title. Love to see him back with the title and something more built around him as a centerpiece. He's kind of got an amateur wrestler look. He talks well. He's tough in the ring the way he works. He always has great matches. If you're not familiar with him because you don't watching this product, you're missing out. In my opinion, one of the best in the world right now as far as overall package. So summary, show flows well with matches. They all have stories behind them. Every match here was building to something. It was either building to something or hyping a character. There was a purpose behind everything going on to lead into something else. But it's a good roster of talent and just a well-done show. The independent wrestling promotion I want to showcase this episode here is called Wrestling Open. They're based out of Worcester, Massachusetts. And every Thursday they have a new episode on the IWTV app. The one I checked out was episode 155. This is a really, really great show. I'm really happy I discovered this product. I kind of just stumbled on it looking at different shows. I click on a lot of indie shows that look interesting by the thumbnail and looking for places in different parts of the country to check out. Some of them I end up not watching solely because the camera work is very bad. Usually if the camera work's decent, I'm going to sit and give it a full attention. And as I did with this one, and I was really amazed with the level of quality they're providing. What I like about this show, it has a real territory kind of feel to it. And by that I mean, it feels like very old school in the most complimentary way possible. It feels like every episode is building to something that's going to go on the next week. They have lots of mic time. These guys are given a chance to develop their characters and personalize the wrestling by being able to talk, and that's important. The matches are great. The crowd's very enthusiastic. I'm going to do a rough guess and say maybe there's like 200 people in the crowd. Only a portion of them are in seats. A lot of them are standing or they're up against the ring. But they're very enthusiastic. They're clearly people that come out and know the product and probably watch it every week or maybe even come out there every week. And it adds a lot to the show how enthusiastic the audience is. Another thing I like that they do here, they do well done video packages before every match. So they recap all the storylines of what's going about to happen in the ring. And since I wasn't real familiar with what was going on here, it brought me up to speed really quick. First rate camera work, just really well filmed. And I just can't emphasize how important of an element that is for an independent promotion, in my opinion, in make or break if you're going to present your product on TV. You gotta have good, strong camera work. There's so many ones I've seen where they have a good roster of names, even some people that I want to actually see like in that setting, and I go to start watching it and the camera work's not just there. And by good camera work, this is what I mean for an indie promotion. A steady hand. So the camera's not moving all over the place and these, and shaking and they're back and forth. Just a steady hand. Usually they have a person on either side of the ring filming, and they just capture the image and let us absorb the image, and not a lot of quick edits. And they have what they call a hard camera, maybe in a stationary position to cut to occasionally, but it kind of feels like when it's done right, you don't even know there is editing. So that's what I'm looking for on that. So let's talk about the specific episode. Now, I do believe I actually said episode 155 earlier. Let me correct. 115. 115. So I just recently watched episode 115, and I immensely enjoyed this, start to finish. I just can't say enough good things about it. Like I said, first-rate independent promotion, a real territory feel to how everything's executed here. In that you're trying to bring people to keep tuning in week to week and come and check out your product live. The product encapsulates so much of what I like about wrestling so much when it's done well. Good talking on the mic, good matches with storylines, some comedy, and also some guys that look like they could be mainstream wrestling stars right on TV right now. The show opens with Paris Van Dale versus Kenny Hardcastle, and they tied in a conflict with Paris Van Dale and Allie Katch before the match. They had this little video segment that occurred outside the venue that they show. So this ends with Allie Katch coming out to set up a 6-woman street fight for their next show. Next up, we get a segment called Wrestler's Court, and this is kind of an insider reference alluding to something in the 90s in WWE that you'd read about in some of the inside newsletters. It was when there was a conflict in the locker room, they'd have a mock court. So that's what this is kind of alluding to. It's a fun segment. They got a judge and bailiff. Judge is Love Doug. The bailiff is Landon Hale. The storyline here is there's tension between Rex Lawless and RJ Rude. They're a tag team. Rex Lawless has a really good look about him. I kept thinking this guy looks like a mainstream TV star. Like he should be on, like by mainstream I mean like AEW or WWE, just by his look. But he talks well. He talks well too. He works well in the ring. He just looks like a star. I looked him up. It said he's actually been around since 2010. Talented guy. And the attorney in this segment, for me, it was a personal treat to see this. Mark Sterling, my second favorite wrestling manager, I think, of all time. Number one is Jim Cornette. Mark Sterling, I think, is so entertaining. He's funny. His mannerisms, his facial expressions, and just it's like physical comedy. I think he should be used for so much more as a manager than he is right now. But this is a ridiculous segment, and by that I mean ridiculous in a good way. It's a fun segment. It allows these guys to show their personalities and show a kind of a comedic side, which is always fun to see in wrestling when it's done well. So it ends up in, of course, complete chaos with Lawless and Rude attacking the judge and bailiff, but it's all in good fun. Next up, we get TJ Crawford, another guy for a really good look and very talented. I've seen him a number of times right now. He always delivers with a really good match. Very athletic. This is a really good match he has here with Jermaine Marbury. What they do is they do the pin with 3 seconds left, but it looks so smooth, right? So all the matches here have a 10-minute time limit, except title matches. So Brad Hollister, who's like the champion, he's aligned with TJ Crawford. There's some interference, but this is a very, very well executed way they did this with 3 seconds. It looked very natural. I really liked the ending here in the finish. I'm talking about the main event here. It was so good. It was so good. A great way to end the show. It was the Shook crew, Bryce Donovan and Bobby Orlando against Brick City for the tag team title. Brick City, the champions. If they don't win, then Shook has to leave the promotion. And these guys, the fans were going wild when these guys came out. Clearly, they're like appear to be the most popular guys in this promotion. Bryce Donovan's another guy that has the look of a TV star. Again, like when he comes out there and this poise and the way he carries himself in the ring, and you could call it the it factor. I looked him up too, and it said he's been started in 2016. Another guy I wouldn't be surprised to see could easily blend in on a mainstream show. Great match. Lots of near finishes. Lots of near finishes here. Lots of 2.75 counts, as I call them, when it's a real close count. So Shook wins. And you know what kind of adds a lot to it is the whole crowd reaction and how excited these people are when these guys win. And this is the part of the ending that I thought was really creative and really well done. So this heel group, Steven Stetson and his Stetson Ranch faction, comes out. It's him and two other guys. He cashes in this Opportunity Knox contract, like their Money in the Bank kind of contract. And, you know, Bryce Donovan and Bobby Orlando were wiped out from the last match. There's this huge beatdown, but they do this real nice attention to detail here where Steven Stetson doesn't allow the ring announcer to ring the bell until after a complete beatdown. Then they come in and just easily win the belt. And the show ends with Bryce Donovan just quitting, like going to ring, I quit. And it's just good. It got me where I'm like, I want to see the next episode. I want to keep watching this. And that's what you want as a viewer, a show to make you want to keep watching it. Everything about this show is logical in a wrestling sense, and it's just great to see. And again, the way they ended the show, I thought was phenomenal. Where Bryce Donovan just quits in the ring and walks out. I mean, like I said, it looks so realistic, and that's what you want. You want some realism in there. Okay, so my 3 favorite kinds of wrestling merchandise to collect are figures, books, and DVDs. And I'm going to be showcasing all 3 from my collection in upcoming episodes of the show, as well as some of the new product that I get. So wrestling DVDs, let's start with that first. Wrestling DVDs in the mid to late 2000s into the 2010s, to a lesser degree, they were very prevalent. There were a lot of titles being released in the various large chain stores where DVDs were sold. A lot of time these places would have new titles like weekly, and there'd be a variety of stock, you know. You'd have a lot of the, not just WWE DVDs. The WWDs were very good. They were documentaries usually on certain wrestlers, then a second disc with matches. It'd be both current people and legends. As they acquired the different library footage, you know, from like World Class AWA and Mid-South, there'd be theme-based DVDs compiled, you know, around the promotion. There was a lot of like theme-based WCW DVDs that were released, built around events like Starrcade and Clash of Champion and Great American Bash. There was independent kind of companies releasing them. I don't mean independent wrestling. I just mean independent production companies doing DVDs on assorted wrestlers and themes. TNA started releasing a lot of DVDs on a regular basis too in the mid-2000s. Mid-South Wrestling, like I mentioned, WWE did 1 DVD on them. Now, that is a promotion that always had a certain mystique about it for me. When I first started really getting into wrestling, Mid-South was not accessible because there was no internet, and you either had to trade tapes, which was something I never got into doing, or you had to be in the local area where you could actually see it on the local channel. And I didn't have access to Mid-South, but I'd read about it in the magazines. And then some of the stars from there, like Jim Duggan, Ted DiBiase, Steve Williams, they made their way into either WWF or NWA. But I always would hear about what a great product Mid-South was, and it had good storylines and competitive matches on TV. By competitive matches, I mean they'd have 2 stars facing each other on TV, which was unusual for that era. And Mid-South had a reputation of hard-hitting, tough wrestlers, no gimmicks. When it became UWF and they made an attempt to go national, it got national syndication. And I talked a little bit about UWF earlier, and that kind of gave me a little bit of a taste of Mid-South. and I really liked UWF, and it always was intriguing wanting to see Mid-South. So like I got the WWF Mid-South DVD. I never watched it for some reason, never watched it, but I will soon. And here's why I'm going to be watching this DVD soon. Okay, I was recently going through one of the boxes of DVDs I have, and I came across this title, Mid-South Wrestling Presents Giants, Midgets, Heroes, and Villains 2 from Universal Archives Company. The tape's around 150 minutes, and I believe it was released around the mid-2000s. Let me go ahead and read you the back of the DVD. Once again, fans can relive the legendary glory age of wrestling, and once and for all, know that the bone-breaking, blood-pounding action is real. Several of the matches on this DVD, when originally aired on TV, had to run with a disclaimer because the content was over-the-top vicious and bloody. The infamous match between Ric Flair and Ted DiBiase in a concussion bandage, the ambush beating Hacksaw Jim Duggan received by the hands of Ted DiBiase and his henchmen, the intentional blinding of JYD, Junkyard Dog, by Midnight Express, and the brutal beating Ric Flair endured by the Freebirds during an NWA Championship cage match. So there you go, that's the back of the DVD. So I checked this DVD out, and it was really enjoyable. It gave me a really good feel for Mid-South. It has matches from TV and some segments from an announcer's desk commenting on events that give you context. There's some video packages too. There's one of Hacksaw Jim Duggan. There's one of Buzz Sawyer. It's interesting to see an early promo for Jim Duggan. There's no dates kind of attributed to the footage here. I'm guessing it's likely between 82 and 84. But there's a very episodic feeling from watching the clips. It doesn't feel disjointed. What I'd really like to do is actually watch a month's worth of their shows in order from this period. I mean, I enjoyed it that much. It made me want to actually see the TV shows in a kind of a chronological period. And there's a lot of names on here just prior to them going to WWF for that mid-80s explosion. You got Jake Roberts, King Kong Bundy, Junkyard Dog, Nikolai Volkov, Butch Reed, Ted DiBiase, Jim Duggan, to name a few. And they're all in competitive matches on this DVD. So like I said, this gives you a really good feel for the Mid-South product if you're not familiar with it and what was so special about it. Highlights of the DVD for me were footage of Ted DiBiase getting a brainbuster on concrete from Dick Murdoch and then being carried out on a stretcher. Just a very realistic feel, very gritty. In general, the product ages very well on here. I mean, they're talking about match stuff that's like 40 years old. It's interesting to see Butch Reed here in a post-match interview. He is a fan favorite, which is much different than he was ever presented in WWF and NWA, and I know that he had a big following as a fan favorite. We get a bounty match with Jim Duggan and the one-man gang. We get a young Shawn Michaels in a tag team match where Jake Roberts pins him. But there's a lot of stuff on here. There's a lot of stuff. I think if you go to watch it, you'll find something that stands out for you that would be your favorite footage. For me, like I said, it was the Dick Murdoch and Ted DiBiase segment. So WWE owns the Mid-South Library. My research indicates they own it now, right? And they've owned it since 2012. But amazingly enough, it appears this DVD is still available on mail order through like the Universal Wrestling Archive site, the company that made the original DVD. And they had other stuff on there. They had other DVDs. They had house show footage. So I'm not sure what the particulars are of that, but I was quite surprised to find you could actually still get this DVD. So I'll be looking to get a few more of these because I really enjoyed this. And since this is volume 2, there's clearly volume 1, obviously. And so I'll be looking to get more of these. These were enjoyable. I'm going to look through my boxes. I don't think I have any more from this company, but you never know. So now let's talk wrestling figures. So I've been collecting wrestling figures almost as long as I've been watching wrestling. The first few I got were the LJN line in the mid-80s. They were these rubber figures, a little bit larger. Hulk Hogan, Junkyard Dog, Rowdy Roddy Piper, Iron Sheik. They aren't in the best condition they could be. Got beat up a little bit, but still cool to have still after all these years in C. I also got the AWA line that came out, I believe, from my understanding and research, it actually came out slightly before LJN. but I have quite a few from the AWA line. I have the Road Warriors 3-pack, which was Hawk Animal and Paul Ellering. I have Baron von Raschke and Larry Zbyszko. That was a 2-pack that came. Ric Flair and Rick Martel. Now, these figures didn't always look so much like the guys too much, but I like these. They were cool. They've held up well. They're still in good condition. They're kind of were molded like the He-Man figures from the 80s, if you remember, and the current WWE Superstars line. Kind of like a harder plastic where like the arms and legs are attached and they're solid, but you can move them a little bit. And then I have a few of these random figures from the 90s. The Galoob, which was the WCW kind of smaller rubber line. I have a few of those. Hasbro, which was the WWE line, or WWF at the time. I have a few of those. I have a lot of the ones from the 2000s from Jakks Pacific. I got kind of real big into collecting them then. And back then they were pretty easy to find. You could go into Toys R Us. Does anybody remember that place? And they'd have like racks of these things, and they'd always have all the new ones coming out. Or you could go to independent stores. So I got a lot of them from that era. I kind of got back into it a lot in 2021, starting initially like with the Mattel WWE ones, then into the AEW ones, which were initially very, very hard to find. Then got easier to find in the stores and now seem like hard to find again. There's a lot of good wrestling figures being put out now by independent companies. Just to name a few of them, there's a Micro Brawlers line from Pro Wrestling Tees. These are kind of smaller rubber figures. There's the Major Bendies, which they have an Extreme series of Extreme wrestlers. They have their ones with their regular lines of like, it's a mix of legends and current names. They have their big rubber guys line, which is very similar to the LJN ones, and that one's legends. The most recent ones they've done pre-orders on are Powers of Pain, Warlord and Barbarian, and Dusty Rhodes. There's a lot of companies doing that kind of Remco AWA figure style right now. Several of them doing that. But in general, with all these figures that are from these different independent companies, it's pre-orders. And you might be able to find a few of them pop up after they're released, maybe overstocks on their sites. But if you really want them, pre-order is the way to go. But my favorites, I'd say right now, are the Micro Brawlers line and the Big Rubber Guys line. I'll cover them more in depth in future episodes, but those are two you're going to want to check out. The company that I want to talk about in this episode more in depth is called Powertown. They're a newer company. They have a couple different lines going. They have one called the Remco Powertown All-Star Wrestlers that just had a pre-order back in March. And this had some cool names that you wouldn't see figures of, right? No, right? Nick Bockwinkel. They had a Magnum, TA, and Tully Blanchard pack together, kind of tributing their famous I Quit match from 1985. They had Rock and Roll Express figure pack, Ricky Morton, Robert Gibson, Bobo Brazil, Jim Duggan, Tito Santana, I believe was the other. The ones I pre-ordered were Bobo Brazil and Nick Bockwinkel. I like the legends in general, and I always am interested in if it's somebody that I've never seen a figure on. This same company is also putting out the TNA line. It's in pre-order right now, TNA Ultras. So I'm really excited about that. The quality of them looks really good in the detail. It's Eddie Edwards, Josh Alexander, Jordan Grace, and Moose. So that's exciting. The TNA's having figures again. Their signature line is the Wrestling Ultras line. Line 2 is coming out soon, I hear. I haven't seen the pre-order yet, but some of the names in there, these are some unique names to have figures of. Dory Funk Jr., Wahoo McDaniel, Jack Briscoe, Kamala, Junkyard Dog, and I read it was going to be his Mid-South look, and Medusa. So those are some cool names that we'll be looking forward to coming out. But the line I'm going to cover in detail here is Powertown's Wrestling Ultra Series. This is the first one they put out. So I stumbled onto this line, the Powertown Wrestling Ultra Series. I was reading something that was like news on different figures online, and it was referencing this company had some stock in, and I had never heard of them, and I went and checked out their site, and I was pretty amazed when I saw what they had on there. One, the names they were featuring, and then the quality of the way the figures looked. And the figures they had, that they had Series 1, which they had released earlier and done pre-orders on a while before, was coming in late in the game, were some unique names: Stan Hansen, Bruiser Brody, Magnum TA, Lou Thez, and Vern Gagne. So their focus is legends. Two of the people behind the company are Greg Gagne, and Magnum TA, and also one of the people that was focal on Remco AWA figures back in the 80s. So I was pretty excited when I saw these. And the one that I got was most excited about when I saw this was Vern Gagne. Okay, a couple of reasons why. Vern Gagne, of course, I was a big fan of AWA, but Vern Gagne, to me, was more special for another reason, right? So let me tell you a Vern Gagne story. In 1991, the AWA had just gone out of business, and I was writing for the wrestling magazines at the time, and they let me, for the most part, pretty much just come up with the topics I wanted to write about. So how it would work, if I wanted to interview somebody, it was my responsibility to track them down, do the interview with them, and I'd write the story, and then I'd send it into the magazine. And it wasn't always easy to track people down back then because there wasn't internet, there wasn't emails. It was simply a matter of largely getting phone numbers. But in Vern Gagne's case, I wondered if I wrote a letter and sent it to the address that for AWA, whether it would reach him. And I wasn't even sure if he'd get the letter. I wasn't sure if the address was still current because AWA was no longer in business. But I wrote a letter, told him I wanted to do an interview with him. I wrote for magazines, sent him some sample articles. And I was very surprised to actually get a response from him. And he agreed to do an interview with me. So I thought this was very cool because he, a few years before that, was one of the biggest promoters, period, in wrestling. The wrestling wars of the mid 80s. AWA was right in the thick of things, Vern Gagne. So he was a legendary name. And I thought it was very cool that he responded to my letter. We did an interview. I wrote an article on him. And I want to read you the article a little bit, kind of give you a feel for what an article was like in a magazine back then as well. So here we go with the Vern Gagne article from 1991. Legend Vern Gagne's warning to the WWF. Cut out the gimmickry. Now that was not my original title for the article. I don't remember what the original title was. This would have been something the editor, I presume, created. That happened a lot. They'd often change the titles and then they'd put whatever they came up with on the magazine. I kind of thought it was hokey then. I still do. So here's the actual article. In every sport, there are athletes who achieve great success and in the process leave a lasting mark on the history of their athletic endeavor. Basketball has its Wilt Chamberlain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Football has its Bart Starr and Joe Namath. Baseball has its Babe Ruth and Joe DiMaggio. Professional wrestling is a sport that also has its fair share of legends. One Minnesota resident is widely recognized as the great of yesteryear. His name is Vern Gagne, and he held the AWA title 9 times. Gagne has been involved in wrestling for over 4 decades. In his youth, he was quite a formidable amateur wrestler. During his 4 years at the University of Minnesota, Gagne established himself as one of the best amateurs in the nation by winning the Big Ten 4 times and the national title twice. Vern was so good on the mat, he was chosen to represent the United States at the 1948 Olympics. Ever since he was 11 years old, Vern Gagne dreamed of becoming a professional wrestler. When he finished as a collegiate wrestler, it was only logical that he would turn pro. A group of former University of Minnesota athletes who had become pro wrestlers, including Joe Passendak and Butch Levy, took the young Gagne under the wings and trained him. Now, all the above information I just read was told to me by Vern himself. So it wasn't from research or anything. What I would do is I'd take the conversations and kind of turn them into narratives instead of running it as a question and answer piece, which was almost never done in wrestling magazines at the time in that era that I worked for. So let's go back to the story here. His long-awaited pro wrestling debut took place on May 10th, 1949 against veteran wrestler Abe King Kong Cash. My debut took place just 2 weeks after my last collegiate win, recalled Gagne. A big crowd turned out for the match, and a big deal was made because of my status as a former University of Minnesota athletic star in football and wrestling. During the next few decades, Gagne met many of the sport's greatest stars, including Lou Thesz, Buddy Rogers, and Argentino Rocco. Of the many wrestlers that Gagne faced during the course of his career, he cites Englishman Billy Robinson as one of the toughest. Billy was a very tough wrestler who always gave me a good fight. He really knew the scientific side of the sport well, said Gagne. Older fans may recall that Verne Gagne and Billy Robinson starred in a 1972 movie entitled The Wrestler, along with actor Ed Asner. Although Verne achieved great success in all the wrestling territories in which he appeared, it was the AWA where he achieved his greatest fame. The AWA was officially born in 1957. So what follows is Verne's storyline version of how the AWA formed, and I'm sure like much of pro wrestling, the actual behind-the-scenes account was probably more dramatic and intriguing. The formation of the AWA came as a result of a dispute among NWA promoters. As Verne recalls, the NWA champion Lou Thesz had been dodging a lot of contenders, and he was also getting disqualified in a lot of matches. Fred Kohler, the promoter in Chicago, said if Thesz got disqualified in an upcoming match at his arena, he would recognize Edouard Carpentier as his opponent as the champion. In the now famous match against Carpentier, Thesz was in fact disqualified. Kohler and several other promoters followed through on their threat and began recognizing Carpentier as champion. Meanwhile, many NWA promoters were still recognizing Thesz as champion. Kohler and his group broke away from the NWA and formed the AWA with Carpentier as their champion. A short time later, in Omaha, Nebraska, Verne defeated the Frenchman to win his first AWA championship. On May 10, 1981, the legendary Verne Gagne retired from full-time ring work after a long and illustrious career. After his retirement, Verne stayed active in wrestling, working as a promoter for the AWA. Many of today's biggest stars can credit Gagne with getting them their start in professional wrestling. Over the years, many young hopefuls were taught the skills necessary to become wrestlers at Verne Gagne's Minnesota training camp. His most famous class was in 1972. That year, Ken Patera, the Iron Sheik, Jim Brunzell, and Verne's son Greg all trained under Verne's watchful eye. The man who would become the most famous graduate of that class was Ric Flair. Today, Gagne admits that Ric Flair's huge success has surprised even him. "I didn't think he would go as far as he did," admitted Gagne. Flair came to Gagne's camp after spending 2 years at the University of Minnesota as a wrestler and football player. He was overweight, carrying 300 pounds on his frame. "I worked him hard during training and was able to help him bring his weight down," said Gagne. Flair had one ingredient back then Verne believes helped make him a success more than anything else. "More than anything, I have to say Flair was a dedicated student of professional wrestling," added Gagne. "He was very serious about getting into shape and becoming a good wrestler." As the promoter of the AWA, Verne had nearly every one of today's top stars at one time or another working for him. Hulk Hogan first achieved national fame while wrestling for Gagne. So wrestling lore had it that like Hulk Hogan came to AWA after being fired by Vince McMahon Sr. And the reason he was fired was because he played the Thunder Lips, a bit part in Rocky III. So it goes, McMahon Sr. told Hogan if he took the part offered to him by Sylvester Stallone, then he would be fired. As it turned out, Hogan's brief appearance as Thunder Lips, where he wrestled Rocky like in an exhibition wrestler versus boxer match, I think was in many ways the general public's, that is non-wrestling fans' introduction to Hogan. One has to ponder this alternative pro wrestling world that might exist. Perhaps, if Vince McMahon did not bring Hogan back to the WWF and make him the focal point of the national expansion in the mid-'80s, what if Hogan had remained in AWA and Vernon made him champion over then-champion Nick Bockwinkel, and Hogan had stayed in AWA for a while? What would the pro wrestling world look like today? Would it have be different? Would it have still been dominated by one mega company as the 80s progressed into the 90s? All this would make a really great alternative history wrestling fiction story, but that's for another day. So let's go back to the story here. When Hulk Hogan first contacted Gagne while looking for a job in AWA, he was at the end of his rope, so to speak, remembers Gagne. "He called me on the phone and I had never heard of him before," recalled Gagne. "He told me that he couldn't make it the way things were going and that if he didn't get work up here in AWA, he was ready to quit wrestling." Gagne decided to use the blonde-haired giant and brought him into the AWA. According to Gagne, it was in the AWA that Hulk Hogan, quote, found himself. We changed him into who he is today by sitting him down and telling him who he was. A light just went on and he started doing good interviews and building up a following. While in AWA, Hogan nearly beat Nick Bockwinkel for the title on several occasions. Finally, frustrated over not winning the title, he left for the WWF, where he quickly captured the WWF Championship from the Iron Sheik. Again, pure storyline talk here in this article. We always wrote about stuff as if it were real, an extension of TV. There was no behind-the-scenes gossip or lingo, like there might be today if this was being done. So Iron Sheik was what you'd call a transitional champion. That was the term used to describe like a heel in the 80s, bad guy in 80s wrestling lingo, okay, who wins the title from one wrestler, Bob Backlund in this case, and quickly loses it to another wrestler. So this formula went back to the very beginning of the WWF title history. Ivan Koloff was the first. He was a transitional champ for Pedro Morales. Stan Stasiak was the transitional champion from Pedro Morales to Bruno Sammartino. And for well over 2 decades, the only heel to hold the title for more than a very brief time was superstar Billy Graham. And McMahon Sr. from lore supposedly told him the exact day he would lose the strap when he won it, which was about a year later. But I'm digressing. Let's go back to 1991 in this article. Things changed drastically in wrestling when Vince McMahon Jr. decided to make WWF a national promotion in the mid-80s. As a result of McMahon's expansion into a national promotion, the opportunities for wrestlers in general to make a full-time living have been greatly decreased in Gagne's opinion. There used to be 26 booking offices in this country, said Gagne. Now there are only 2. So the other promotion Vern Gagne was referring to here was WCW. In the early days of then using the WCW name, they had not too long before this been bought by Ted Turner from Jim Crockett. So they were the group formerly known as NWA and run by Jim Crockett Jr. And Jim Crockett Jr. was the last of the promoters from that promotional wars of the 80s to fall to the McMahon Empire, right? So anybody who experienced, these mid to late 80s NWA live shows, I think would have fond memories. They were action-packed, sold-out arenas, passionate fan base. So here we go again with the article. Vern Gagne is a man who is strongly opposed to the WWF style of wrestling. He feels the cartoon type of characters are turning away adult fans. McMahon has created an organization that only has appealed to kids 14 or younger, contends Gagne. By using wrestlers that display such poor quality of wrestling in the ring, he makes the sport look bad to the general public. Like many former wrestlers, Gagne is saddened to see the WWF forcing many smaller booking offices out of business. He observes that it is now tough for new faces to develop and break into the sport. Okay, so obviously WWE would later set up a developmental program. This would go into, for promotion in conjunction, which is now NXT. And all the new faces, most of them come from that, right? They've graduated from that. As WWF became bigger and bigger, Gagne found that the wrestling audience consisted more and more of young kids that wanted cartoon images instead of down-to-earth, solid wrestling action. Today, it seems in order to be considered a wrestler, you need horns on your head or paint on your face, said Gagne. Gagne is among a growing number who are tired seeing untalented wrestlers filling up the scene. These guys come out and say, here is my body, I'm wonderful, look at my big muscles. They can't do anything in the ring but kick, punch, and clothesline. These men are not wrestlers, points out Gagne. Today, the AWA no longer promotes wrestling shows. When the buying public began asking for glitzy showmanship and silly gimmicks, Gagne refused to change his organization's style. Gagne wanted to promote wrestling shows, not soap operas. Wrestling fans can catch glimpses of the AWA style of wrestling each week on the syndicated show Matt Classics. This show highlights great AWA matches in the past. Gosh, I don't even remember that show, Matt Classics. ESPN must have carried them for a while after the promotion itself really wasn't active. Will the AWA ever promote again? When the public grows tired of the gimmickry and non-wrestling oriented shows the WWF promotes, we will emerge again, said Gagne. Gagne is a man who has made many contributions to the sport of professional wrestling over the years. and he has enjoyed all the fan support he has received. I appreciate the support wrestling fans have given me since I broke into wrestling. This is a great, great sport, and I really hate to see it destroyed the way it is. A legendary wrestler, trainer, and promoter, Verne Gagne is a man who will not soon be forgotten. So the AWA never did promote again under Verne's direction. So years after I wrote this article, when social media first came around, I located Greg Gagne and I sent him a copy of the article. And right after I had written this article, Verne Gagne had sent me this really nice letter. It was on AWA letterhead. And I know it's in a box somewhere. I've looked for it numerous times. It's the one piece of memorabilia I can't find. I would love to find it and frame it. But it was on AWA letterhead. It was a really nice letter from him, thanking me for writing the article and how much he enjoyed it. And he said he thought I had a real feel for wrestling, and it was signed by him, and is a real cool memorabilia. And I sent Greg Gagne a copy of the article. I mentioned how nice his father was when I had met him and talked to him. He sent me back a thank you letter, and I had asked Greg Gagne if he had ever thought about doing a wrestling book on the history of the Gagne family in AWA, and he said at the time he wasn't really interested in pursuing that. But that is something I think would be a really interesting book, is the history of the AWA from Greg Gagne. So now let's take a look at these figures. And when I got the first one in the mail, this Verne Gagne, I was just amazed at the quality of this. I mean, it even looked even better than the pictures. They have really nice packaging. It almost looks like a book. It's very thick, like a thick hardback, but it's very nice packaging. It's easy to get the figure out of there. When you open up the flap, on the front it's got kind of a drawing almost. It looks like a Verne Gagne. It comes with his AWA belt. And then it's got a little bio on him. It talks about how he was on the 1948 Olympic team. He debuted in 1949. It talks about how he was a 10-time AWA World Heavyweight Champion. It's a nice little bio. And then on the back they have a list of all the people they have in the figure line. The figure itself is really good. A really good detail. They sold for $55, which is definitely on the upper end of what I pay for figures. But I think this is justified. This is just a whole other level of quality and detail, the way this is made. I'm actually holding them right now looking at it. But it's the face on this that is so point on. And I think I mentioned this before, but that's really, to me, as a figure collector, is so much the key and the make or break. It's got to look like the guy. And you'd be surprised. It's better now than it was maybe 10 years ago, but a lot of times, sometimes the faces are off. But this is a really good face of a young Verne Gagne. By the way, some of the pictures in the box are similar pictures that he actually sent me, I believe, for this article. The article that I read, all the photos from that came from him that he sent me. So it looks like some of the same promotional pictures. But so the figure's wearing a blue jacket. On the back it says Verne, a VG on the front. It's kind of it's just a cool looking figure, and it looks like him, very retro. I like that one so much. I got the Curry Von Erich figure next. And this one is flat out one of the best figures I have as far as detail and looking like the person. Gosh, this thing looks, the face is so good on this. He's wearing a blue jacket. It says Von Erich Country on the back. It's got the state of Texas and the yellow rose colored in it. So these figures are like scale, and by that I mean they're not all the same height. They tried to make them proportionally, so like the Verne Gagne figure is smaller than the Curry one. I went back on their site to go to another one, and the only one they had left was Bruiser Brody. And the other ones were all sold out, and I got that one. And again, just the attention to detail. He's got these kind of bloody scars on his head. He's wearing like the vest. He's how I remember him when he was in AWA and World Class. The fur kind of boots, the knee pad. And their boxes are similar in that, I mean, they have these kind of drawing type pictures on them. And then they got little bios inside of them. Pictures, like when you open the flap. But this is a really cool figure line. This is a high-end collectible. Each figure comes kind of with a title belt from what they were associated with. For Curry Von Erich, it's the World Class Wrestling Association World Heavyweight title. For Bruiser Brody, it's the PWF World Tag Team Championship belt. It was like a Japanese title. But these are really cool figures. I encourage you to check them out as a collector. I'm very excited for line 2 that should hopefully be having a pre-order soon. So Powertown Wrestling Ultra Series. Seek it out. You will not be disappointed. Some of the best wrestling figures I have. The 3 that I have are all prominently displayed on one of my shelves front and center, which is always reserved for my absolute favorite ones. So let's talk about wrestling books. I have a huge collection of wrestling autobiographies. I love reading wrestling autobiographies. The very first one I got was on a guy named Irish Pat Barrett. He was a WWF Tag Team Champion with Dominic DeNucci. I believe it was some point in the 70s. He had an ad in a wrestling magazine in, I think it was 1990, advertising a book that he had, an autobiography, and I wrote him a letter and asked if he'd do an interview and I could write a review of the book as part of it. And he got in touch with me, sent me a very nice letter, a signed copy of the book, and that was the first wrestling book I read. I still have it. I think it's one of those ones that'd be very hard to find these days. And then the next one I got after that, I remember I did get this next one in the store. It was Bruno Sammartino, like a paperback. But autobiographies in wrestling in general were very unusual in the early 90s. You could find generalized books about wrestling with bios of the different wrestlers, like short bios. Those were popular in the mid 80s. I have a bunch of those. Like a lot of them are like hardback coffee table size books. And even there was a few, I think, in the later 70s that were like paperback but larger size books. But it was a Mick Foley book, Have a Nice Day, in the late 90s that really, in my opinion, opened the door to a flood of wrestling books being published. And it seemed like at some point in the early to mid 2000s, every month there were multiple new books on the shelf. Now, supposedly what I had read is before the Mick Foley book, publishers didn't think wrestling books would make any money. That's ridiculous, right? They didn't think wrestling fans would read books. They don't read books. I mean, I've read that several times, but the Mick Foley book was like a bestseller, and it allowed other books to get published after that. And they were easy to find for a while, and then it seems like what happened, maybe, I don't know at what point, but maybe in the last decade, they're harder to find in stores now. They're more infrequently available. But what I found is there's still a ton of them being published. You just get a mail order. That's how you get them. And there's a ton of them being published. I don't know why there's not more of them in stores. But the one I want to showcase today is not a new book. And I got it about a year ago. And I didn't even pick it up to read it till very recently. And then when I read it, I was like, this is a really, really incredible book where you learn a lot on an interesting person. And I wanted to make this the first one I feature. And this is a Brutus Beefcake book. And I was quite surprised when I saw that he had a book out. And this book was published, I believe, 2017. Yeah, that's what it says here. I'm holding the book here right now. So the book's called Brutus the Barber Beefcake, Strutting and Cutting. It's co-writers Kenny Casanova. The company is Walking on Hot Waffles. Kenny Casanova's worked on a number of other books with wrestlers. I read the book he did with Kamala that was also quite good a number of years ago. So in a wrestling autobiography, what I'm looking for is lots of stories. I want a behind-the-scenes feel. I want to feel as if I'm traveling with the person on the road, experiencing what they're experiencing, witnessing things. And this book has that. And it's an interesting, too, because I'm always interested in autobiographies from this period, the mid-'80s. The golden era, as I think of it. That big expansion period. I don't know how this book wasn't in bookstores because I feel like he's a big name and the book itself is good, but it was not in book. I never saw this in bookstores. But you're going to learn a lot about Brutus Beefcake here. It's very comprehensive. The book is, I'm looking here, it's about running close to 400 pages. That's what I like too. I look for the ones that are bigger. And it starts off of his early life. It gets into when he first broke into wrestling. Many of you probably know this. He's a close personal friend of Hulk Hogan. They know each other pre-wrestling. That's how he got into wrestling. and it's got a great deal of information about him pre-WWF. Honestly, I knew very little about him pre-WWF. I knew he had a tag team where he tag teamed a lot with Hogan early in their careers, and he went by the name, I think, Dizzy Hogan, and I didn't know a lot. It was kind of vague, but he kind of goes through that whole period, and he gives you a real good feel for territory wrestling circa, I believe, late 70s, kind of early 80s, what it was like. He talks about breaking into the WWF, and he was there at a key point in history. It's interesting to read. I mean, so you get a lot of detail in this book on him that you know that you, if you're a fan of his, I would say you're not gonna know. We coming up with he breaks the chapters down into the different territories, and it's like 12 chapters before we even get to WWF. But you're going to learn a lot also about his life after his mainstream peak. I didn't know a lot about him after the WWF period, right? When I think of Brutus Beefcake, I think of the Dream Team with Greg the Hammer Valentine in the mid-'80s. And then right after that, when they made him a good guy, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. And I remember him a little bit in WCW, and he had a couple different gimmicks, but I didn't know a lot about him, and then he kind of was gone, right? To this parasailing accident he was in that was well known, that it happened in 1990. Horrific accident, goes into a lot of detail about this. From what I remember reading, he was supposed to win the Intercontinental title, and then obviously this accident derailed his career. He ends up actually coming back to wrestling. He's in WCW under various different names. I do remember a little bit of that. But you're gonna get everything in more detail, kind of fleshed out. You're gonna learn a lot about Hulk Hogan, I've never heard before, and you're gonna learn about Brutus Beefcake kind of after his time on TV was gone, like what was going on in his life. And this whole story really just humanizes him as a person. I mean, he goes into great detail about his life after mainstream wrestling was done, and he faced a lot of challenges, and I found his story inspiring. I just felt like it was kind of like, just keep going and don't give up. And it was a very personal story. And I found myself like just a bigger fan of the guy after reading the whole book. So excellent book. Highly recommend it. If you're a huge fan of Brutus Beefcake, an absolute must. If you're a fan of 80s wrestling, frankly, if you're a fan of wrestling and you're not familiar with his whole period, read this. You're going to enjoy it, and you're going to learn a lot. Well, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next episode. If you have any topics you'd like to hear me discuss, please send an email to tpwemedianetwork@outlook.com.